Thanks, Richard, and thank you all for coming. So my talk today is going to be on this question, do the laws of nature point to God? And the subtitle I would give it is what every MIT student should know about the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. Just a spoiler, my answer to this question is yes, but not conclusively. So I think that the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life that we'll discuss tonight really is a valid argument for the existence of God, but it's not a knockdown argument. So it needs to be weighed against other arguments against the existence of God. But before we get into all that, let me say a little bit more about myself. So I am a theoretical physicist, as Richard said. More specifically, my research deals with string theory and early universe cosmology. Please note that I'm a cosmologist, not a cosmetologist. So a cosmologist studies the early universe, a cosmetologist studies cosmetics. I'd like to say that maybe at some point I'll be a tenured professor, I can start doing whatever I want, and my research will maybe venture into the third category, but for now it's pretty solidly focused on the first two. So let me recommend some further reading if you are interested in anything I have to say tonight. The first one is a book called A Fortunate Universe by Geraint Lewis and Luke Barnes. Geraint and Luke are both astrophysicists. Geraint is an atheist, Luke is a theist. They agree on all of the science, so that's the first 95% of the book. But then in the last chapter, they sort of have a debate about the existence of God and whether or not God makes the problem any better. So it's a very interesting chapter, and it's a very well written and well researched book, so I'd highly recommend that. Of course, books cost money, blogs are free, so let me point you to a few blogs on this topic and related topics. One is called Undivided Looking by Aaron Wall, who's a professor of physics at the University of Cambridge. Luke Barnes, I already mentioned, has a blog called Letters to Nature, and my own blog is significantly worse and has not nearly as many articles, but it's called Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, and I do have a series of posts on this topic of fine-tuning, so feel free to consult that. A quick outline of where we're headed tonight. I'm going to start off by introducing the basics of fine-tuning, the science behind it. We're going to look at proposed explanations for fine-tuning. I will then field questions from myself on objections to design, getting away from the science and a little bit more philosophical. And finally, I'll open up the floor to questions from you all. So, first of all, basics of fine-tuning. What's the whole idea here tonight? What's the science that we're discussing? So, the two most well-established fundamental theories of physics are what are known as the standard models of cosmology and particle physics, respectively. And if you look at the standard models of cosmology and particle physics, you'll find that they have a number of free parameters in them. In other words, these are quantities which are not predicted by the theories, but rather they're just input into the theories by hand as additional data. Some of these constants you surely recognize. There's the speed of light. There's Newton's gravitational constant, you may remember from an introductory physics class, which measures the strength of gravity between two distant objects. There's the mass of the electron. There's some other quantities that you're probably not so familiar with. And you can see here in the right-hand column the values that they take in our universe. Now, the idea behind fine-tuning is that research in physics has revealed that for many of these quantities, if we were to imagine tuning them, making them either a little bit smaller than they are or a little bit larger than they are, we would find a universe governed by laws that just doesn't allow for intelligent life. In other words, if you were to take one of these constants and move it just a little bit smaller or a little bit larger, we wouldn't exist. There'd be no human life, there would be no intelligent life whatsoever. So there are many examples of this, but I'll give you just two to sort of illustrate the idea here. One is the fine-tuning of the strong force. Okay, so there's this parameter alpha sub s, which measures the strength of the strong force. It's about 0.11 in our universe. If it were less than about 0.1, stars wouldn't be able to shine. If it were greater than about 0.12, there wouldn't even be hydrogen. So we wouldn't have a periodic table at all. In either case, no life as we know it. There are many more examples, as I say, but by far the most impressive fine-tuning, and the one that's discussed the most, is the so-called fine-tuning of the cosmological constant. This is a parameter indicated by the Greek capital letter lambda. It's about 10 to the minus 120 in our universe. If we're about the same size but negative, the universe would collapse upon itself. If we're just a little bit larger, galaxies wouldn't be able to form. In either case, again, no life as we know it. Now, it's important to realize here that these problems of fine-tuning are not just things that some Christian somewhere invented to cause problems where there were none. These are really serious problems that drive a lot of modern research in physics. Cliff Burgess and Guy Moore, for instance, write in the Standard Model of Primer, the cosmological constant problem is arguably the most severe theoretical problem in high-energy physics today. The late Harvard physics professor Sidney Coleman supposedly used to tell his grad students that they should think about the cosmological constant problem for 15 minutes every night before they went to bed. Because the problem is that severe and its implications are that profound for how we think about physics in our universe. So physicists on all hands across the theological spectrum agree that fine-tuning really is a problem. The question is, how does one explain it? So that's what we're going to turn to next. What are the proposed explanations for this observed fine-tuning? The first one is chance. You know, coincidences happen. Maybe it just so happens that all of these constants in the standard models happen to lie exactly where they need to be to give rise to life. I think that this possibility, however, really underestimates how serious of a problem this is. And to illustrate this, we're going to play a little game, okay? Everyone stand up, please. Nice audience participation. All right, everyone pick a digit in your head between 0 and 9, okay? Everyone got it? All right? Now, if you said 3, stay standing, otherwise sit down. Okay, a few 3s, all right? Pick another digit. Everyone got it? Okay, if you said 4, keep standing, otherwise sit down. All right, so we have how many people still standing? 3 there? All right, what's the next digit? 6? 6, 5, 8? It's 7, okay, everyone sit down. No one else, right? I was impressed that people made it that far. Okay, 3 people actually. We could have kept going on this, but here's the point. Solving the cosmological constant problem merely by chance would be like repeating that procedure another 111 times and getting the right digit every single time. So let's not be ridiculous. Chance alone is not going to explain this. We need something else at least. So how about this possible explanation? This is from Sean Carroll, physicist. He says, we just don't know whether life could exist if the conditions of our universe were very different because we only see the universe that we see. So maybe fine-tuning isn't a problem because we only see this one universe. So how are we to know what the universe would be like if the laws were different? Now, I have great respect for Sean Carroll as a theoretical physicist, but I don't understand how a theoretical physicist could say something like this. Because the whole point of theoretical physics is to predict what our universe would look like if the laws were different. Here's an example. On this plot, we have the data from the cosmic microwave background, shown in these little data points with black dots and some error bars that are small on the left but larger on the right. And overlaid on this plot of the data are the predictions from several different theories. So in dark red, we have inflation with a cosmological constant. In yellow, we have an open universe. In pink down at the bottom, we have cosmic strings, and so on. Now here's the point. We don't actually need to see a universe. We don't need to live in a universe governed by cosmic strings in order to know that we do not live in a universe. Because you see, the cosmic strings curve does not fit the data very well at all, whereas the inflation with cosmological constant curve fits the data very well. We don't need to live in a universe governed by cosmic strings to know that we don't live in that sort of universe, to know what that sort of universe would look like. We don't need to live in a universe that has a flat Earth in order to know what a flat Earth would look like. Now, let me be generous to Sean Carroll. I think maybe what he's trying to get at is this other objection from another physicist, Victor Stenger. He says, first and foremost, and fatal to the design argument all by itself, or in other words, fatal to this idea that our universe is fine-tuned, is the wholly unwarranted assumption that only one type of life is possible, the particular form of carbon-based life that we have here on Earth. Now this is true, right? We're only familiar with life like ourselves, which is carbon-based. Maybe there are other forms of life out there in the cosmos. However, first of all, this objection might lessen some of the fine-tunings, but it's not going to completely solve the problem. Remember the cosmological constant that we saw before. If we're just a little bit larger but negative, the universe would collapse on itself in less than a second. If it were a little bit larger and positive, there would be no complex objects of any sort. Galaxies, stars, planets, everything would be just ripped apart immediately by the expansion of gravity. It doesn't take much creativity to realize that we're just not going to get any sort of life in either one of those universes. Furthermore, let's be generous and suppose that maybe there is some other form of life out there which doesn't require so much fine-tuning. In other words, that arises in a much larger region of parameter space, as indicated by the gray region on the right. Even if that were true, it still doesn't resolve the problem of why our carbon-based form of life is so fine-tuned. And we know that that's the case. We know that life as we know it would not exist if the parameters were changed just a little bit. So even in this scenario, there's still a question, which is why do we find ourselves living here in that little tiny black dot as opposed to in this supposed vast ocean of life-permitting universes? Why do we happen to be this one exceptional case if there are other cases that aren't so exceptional? Fourth, perhaps there's just some unknown theory which explains fine-tuning. You know, we don't understand quantum gravity very well. We don't understand string theory very well. Maybe when we understand these things better, they'll predict exactly the values for these parameters that we observe in our universe. So maybe, you know, some new theory of physics is going to come in and save the day and explain all of the fine-tuning. The problem with this is that, first of all, it's not enough just to have a theory, to have some more fundamental theory out there. We need a more fundamental theory that also predicts exactly the values of the constants that we observe. And that's actually just a lateral move. It's not actually resolving the problem, it's not helping with the improbability, it's just shifting it into the improbability that such a theory exists and gives us exactly the right predictions in the first place. More generally, it's hard to imagine that some sort of theory, some unknown theory, is going to swoop in and save the day without either violating known physics that we can test or introducing new fine-tuning problems elsewhere. In fact, we have many examples of this in the history of fundamental physics where there was some fine-tuning problem and it was resolved. But the resolution itself also introduces fine-tuning problems. Inflation is one example. So it seems that likely any sort of theory is just going to move the improbability somewhere else. I like to say that if our universe is somehow not fine-tuned, it was assembled in such a way as to fool us into thinking that it was, which is pretty hard to believe. Again, this just isn't just my opinion as some theistic physicist out there. This is the widespread belief of many physicists across the theological spectrum. Lenny Susskind at Stanford, throughout the years, many people have tried to explain why the cosmological constant is small or zero. In other words, why it takes the fine-tuned value that it does. The overwhelming consensus is that these attempts have not been successful. Alex Vilenkin, a cosmologist over at Tufts, as of now, the only viable resolution of the cosmological constant problem is provided by the anthropic approach. Okay, so what is this anthropic approach that he speaks of? Well, there's a couple different flavors. We'll start with the less reasonable one, which is called the strong anthropic principle. And the idea is like this. Let's suppose that our universe just weren't tuned for life. Well, in that case, it wouldn't allow for life at all. So there wouldn't be anyone alive to see it. We can only ever observe a universe that allows for life to exist, that allows for observers to exist. So maybe fine-tuning isn't a problem after all. Finally, we're actually onto something here, as we'll see in a moment. But this by itself is, again, not enough. And there's a famous argument that's often given here to illustrate why, which comes from a Canadian philosopher named John Leslie. I don't know why everyone always points out the fact that he's Canadian, but okay, he's Canadian. And his argument goes like this. Suppose that you're out there and you're facing a firing squad. Okay, so you're set to be executed. And all the soldiers take aim, ready, fire, but they all miss. And the question is why? Now you're perfectly within your rights to say, well, they must have all missed, because I'm still standing here. If they hadn't all missed, I wouldn't be alive to be thinking right now. But that still doesn't explain the problem, right? It's still a problem of why, against seemingly all odds, did they miss? And there's really two possibilities that are worth considering here. The first one is that maybe they just missed on purpose. For whatever reason that you may not understand at the time, they intentionally missed. They missed by design. The other possibility is maybe there are just zillions of executions, you know? And the same way that a zillion monkeys typing on typewriters will eventually produce Shakespeare, a zillion firing squads they're eventually bound to miss, just probabilistically. Eventually it'll happen. Now that wouldn't explain, of course, why they would miss you, but it would explain why at some point somebody's going to be left wondering, how on earth did they all miss me? In the problem at hand, when it comes to explaining fine-tuning, there's analogous solutions. One is that fine-tuning has occurred by design. Some cosmic designer, whatever this may be, has fiddled the knobs exactly where they need to be in order to give rise to a universe that has intelligent beings like us. Other possibility is maybe there are just zillions of universes out there. And if you have enough universes, maybe eventually you get life in one of them. And then, of course, that life would say, life can only observe a universe in which it exists. So this leads to the idea of the multiverse, and we'll talk about that one first. Okay, so maybe there's this huge collection of universes out there, and they have slightly different laws of physics in each one. And so if you look at any particular universe, the odds that it has life is low. But eventually, if you have enough universes, you're bound to get life somewhere, and then the life observes the universe in which is fine-tuned for life. So what are we to make of the multiverse? Well, first of all, I think it's worth noting that a multiverse in its standard incarnation is not something that can be verified empirically. Because we have these different universes out there, but if they're not in contact with our own, then there's no way for us to actually detect by any sort of experiment that they exist. Now that isn't a problem per se. Maybe this is where the evidence leads us and we have to embrace it whether we like it or not. But at the least, it's worth noting that we're sort of moving here beyond empirical science and into the realm of metaphysics. Again, nothing wrong with metaphysics. Let's just note that that's what we're doing here. Now, the next best thing you could hope for, right, if you really want some solid scientific reason to believe in a multiverse, you might not be able to get direct experimental evidence for it, but the next best thing that you could hope for is that maybe there's some theory out there which predicts a multiverse and simultaneously also makes predictions that can actually be verified by experiment in our universe. In that case, any sort of experimental verification for this theory would indirectly give us evidence for the multiverse. Now, despite what some physicists, especially physicists who write popular science books, may say, we really don't have this sort of situation. There is no well-tested theory of physics that unambiguously predicts a multiverse. But if we're willing to wade into more speculative territory, there is actually a pretty decent way to build a multiverse in modern physics. So what do you need to build a multiverse? You need two things. First of all, you need a huge ensemble of possible universes that have slightly different laws in each of them, so that at least one of these universes would allow for intelligent life, like our own. The second thing you need is a way to turn these possible universes into actual universes. In physics terms, we often call this ensemble of universes a landscape, and so you need some way to populate the landscape. Now, within physics today, the best candidates for each of these are what go by the name string theory and eternal inflation, respectively. So string theory seems to give rise to a vast collection of possible universes. We have no idea how many possible universes there are. There are lots of numbers out there in the popular media, and you shouldn't believe any of them. We have no idea how many there are. We don't know that any of them give rise to intelligent life. But at least it could be hoped that this is true. Secondly, a way to actually make these possible universes into real universes is provided by something called eternal inflation. Again, we don't have direct experimental evidence for eternal inflation, but it's not so crazy. So these two theories, they're speculative, but they're not totally wild. If you put them together, you'll get some sort of multiverse. So does that solve fine-tuning? And the answer still is no, not by itself. Because you see, the standard string landscape plus eternal inflation scenario doesn't just lead to a very large multiverse. It leads to an infinite multiverse where anything that can happen does happen an infinite number of times. So for instance, unicorns exist not only in one universe, but in infinitely many universes. Where by unicorns here, I literally mean horses with horns on their head, and if you touch one of them, you're healed. Now, this seems pretty far out, you might say, but it also leads to problems when it comes to computing probabilities in the multiverse. Let's suppose that we want to know the probability of something really crazy happening. Like, what's the probability that someone in this room spontaneously combusts before my talk is over? Now, how would we go about answering a question like that in a multiverse that has this huge ensemble of different universes? Well, what we'd want to do is divide the number of universes in which someone spontaneously combusts by the total number of universes where we're all sitting here. But the problem is that in the string landscape plus eternal inflation scenario, both of these numbers are infinite. And as you all know from the movie Mean Girls, you can't divide infinity by infinity. The limit does not exist. You need some way to regulate these infinities. In other words, you need a way to put a probability distribution on the set of all of the possible universes in the landscape. Mathematicians sometimes refer to a probability distribution as a measure, and so this is known as the measure problem. The problem of how do I define a measure? How do I define a probability distribution on the set of all possible universes that regulates these nonsensical infinities? One cosmologist I talked to a few years ago said it like this: Lots of people have come up with their own solutions to the measure problem, but nobody has really come up with a solution that's compelling to anyone besides the person who thought of it. Many proposed solutions to the measure problem introduce their own fine-tuning problems, predicting things like our universe should be much younger than we observe it to be, or we should be self-aware observers which have popped into existence rather than biologically evolved life forms that we actually observe. In light of these sorts of difficulties, it's very hard to say that the multiverse is a solution to fine-tuning, but it's also not completely clear that it can't do the trick. I like what Nimar Khani Hamed had to say, certainly no theist. He was a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study where I did my first postdoc. He once said, "The multiverse isn't a theory, it's a cartoon. It's our idea of what might be going on." Luke Barnes, "The multiverse may yet solve the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, but it will not be an easy solution. Multiverse is not a magic word that will make all the fine-tuning go away." Okay. So that was a lot of physics, and some of y'all are wondering, why on earth are we talking about this here? Right? I came to reason for God, not reason for learning more physics. What does this have to do with God? Well, let me make an analogy that I think will maybe bridge the gap. I first heard this from Luke Barnes in a talk. And it's, let's suppose that we're all chess pieces, okay? We're all chess pieces living in our little chessboard universe, and we want to know what are the laws of nature in our universe. In other words, what are the rules of chess? And so we start to play, right? We start to play games of chess. We start to learn about the rules. We learn that pawns can only move one space or maybe two. Bishops can only move along diagonals. After a while, we learn about castling. And pretty soon thereafter, we get to a point where we've learned everything there is to know. We know all of the rules of chess. We know every law of nature in our chessboard universe. And some of the pieces say, all right, hey, we're done. That was great. Let's all go home. But some of the pieces hang around afterwards and say, now wait up. Hold on a minute. Why are we playing chess and not checkers? In other words, sure, we figured out all the laws in our universe. But we can still ask the question of why these laws as opposed to some other laws. Why the rules of chess as opposed to the rules of checkers? And the same thing can be said for our own universe. Suppose science became so complete that we knew everything there is to know about the laws of nature in our universe. We could still ask questions like why these laws as opposed to some other laws. Now, everything I've said so far, I think I would say to you whether or not I was a theist, whether I was an atheist or a theist. So far, it's all just been science. But now, this is where I would say I really depart from some of my atheistic colleagues, because so many of my atheistic colleagues seem to just not like to ask that sort of question. Why these laws as opposed to some other laws? Some of them would say that we shouldn't ask that sort of question. But for those of us who dare to ask this question, why these laws as opposed to some other laws? Fine-tuning is important because fine-tuning suggests that the answer might have something to do with us. In other words, maybe the laws are the way they are because this is what they need to be in order to give rise to a world full of intelligent beings. And this leads us to the idea of design. Maybe, for whatever reason, by whatever entity or entities, our universe has been designed to produce a world full of intelligent beings. And I want to leave end the first part of my talk here with my conclusion, which I think I would say, regardless of theological beliefs, theological predispositions, that our best science strongly suggests that either some sort of cosmic designer exists, either design is the answer, or a multiverse exists. A multiverse is the answer, or both. Now, let me remind you that this is also equivalent to saying that our best science strongly suggests that either a cosmic designer exists, or unicorns exist, or both? And I'm actually not trying to just poke fun at the idea of unicorns. Actually, for me, the real issue is to try to deny that either of these exist. And for some of you, that might mean that the world is a very different place than you thought it was when you walked in here. Some of you might have said, I don't believe in all this religion, mumbo jumbo, we're scientific people now, we've moved past all that, I don't believe in God. And you might also say, unicorns, fairy tale nonsense, I don't believe in that. I'm a man of science, or a woman of science. And what I'm here today to tell you is that you really can't find any intellectually satisfying ground denying both of these things. In order to solve fine-tuning, we're going to need one of these to be true. Either a cosmic designer or unicorns or both. And again, I'm not trying to so much poke fun at unicorns. Because I actually think that unicorns are maybe not the worst solution to this. I will defend the unicorn apologists out there who want to say that they think that unicorns exist. I think it's not as crazy as it might seem at first. However, I think that if the alternative is unicorns, God at least deserves a seat at the table. If the alternative is unicorns, we should at least let design have a seat at the table. So with this, I'm now going to open up the floor to questions from myself. That's right, this is happening. I'm going to ask myself some questions about objections to design. Okay, so first question. Yes, you in the hat. Okay, yeah, so this was a really great talk. You clearly know your stuff, and you're also quite good looking. But my question is, this doesn't prove God. This doesn't prove the God of Christianity or theism. How do I know that the designer isn't just some kid in a hyper-advanced civilization simulating our universe on a computer, or the flying spaghetti monster, or something like that? Well, yes, that is quite a good question, and you're quite handsome too, sir. But I think that, first of all, it's true that we do need other arguments to get us to the God of theism, or to the God of Christianity more specifically. In particular, when it comes to Christianity, we really need to start talking about the evidence for the life, death, miracles, and resurrection of Jesus, which I'm going to do in my talk here on Thursday. So stay tuned for that. But even before we get to any other arguments, it should be noted that fine-tuning doesn't leave us completely in the dark as to the properties of this would-be designer. Because fine-tuning suggests that whatever designed this universe must be, first of all, incredibly intelligent enough to understand string theory and quantum gravity when no human alive does. Second of all, it must be incredibly powerful enough to build this entire universe. It must be outside the material universe, because you can't create a universe if you're part of it in the first place. And most importantly, it must be interested in intelligent life. Because if the designer is not interested in intelligent life, then the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life is still a mystery. Again, this isn't getting us all the way to theism, but it is starting to smell an awful lot like God. Next question. Yes, I have a question. My question is, if God designed the universe, then who designed God? So, indeed, this is a common question. Question that is actually in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. He actually goes so far as to call this the central premise of his book, believe it or not. But the argument here, this objection, has a couple of issues with it. First of all, it's not the case that every explanation itself needs an explanation. And don't take my word for it. Listen to what these atheistic philosophers have to say. Here's Gregory Dawes. He says, Dawkins' idea is that religious explanations are unacceptable because they leave unexplained the existence of their explain-ins, namely God. Dawkins apparently assumes that every successful explanation should also explain its own explainings. But this is an unreasonable demand. Many of our most successful explanations raise new puzzles and present us with new questions to be answered. Lipton gives some examples. A drought may explain a poor crop, even if we don't understand why there was a drought. I understand why you didn't come to the party if you explain you had a bad headache, even if I have no idea why you had a headache. The Big Bang explains the background radiation, even if the Big Bang itself is inexplicable, and so on. So explanations don't necessarily themselves need to be explained for them to be good explanations. But I think that there's even another issue here, which is that Dawkins seems to not really have understood the whole idea of theism. The questions, or Dawkins' issue here, is that he seems to suggest that in order to explain our complex and fine-tuned universe, God would need to be even more complex. But the whole idea of theism, the tagline, if you will, is that this is a simple mind with complex thoughts. An unembodied mind with no limits to its knowledge is actually a simple concept, even if it may be difficult for us to understand. Even if the thoughts of that mind, which correspond to our reality, may be very complex. Now, I think that, unfortunately, this sort of misunderstanding is very common. Very often, when I start talking about God, I get this family of objections. If God designed the universe, who designed God? If God created the universe, who created God? If God explains the universe, what explains God? Now, these questions are good questions to ask about the gods of pagan religions. They're also good questions to ask for things like the flying spaghetti monster, or a kid in another universe simulating our universe on a computer. All of these things are finite beings made up of matter and energy. And for things like that, it makes sense to ask, where did the energy come from? Where did the matter come from? But God, the God of theism, is a very different sort of thing, because God is not a God. God, the capital G God of theism, is not a particular instance of a lowercase g God, like the gods of pagan religions, these finite beings made up of matter and energy. God, the God of theism, is by definition the undesigned designer, the unexplained explainer, the unmoved mover, explained by nothing but the necessity of its own being. And so asking a question like, if God designed the universe, who or what designed God, is perfectly analogous to asking a question like, what is holding up the core of the earth? The answer is nothing is holding up the core of the earth. The core of the earth, the center of gravity of the earth, is defined to be the thing which, in a sense, holds up all of the layers of the earth, but which is in and of itself not held up by anything. Now, much more could be said about theism, what it is, who God is. In fact, I gave a talk on exactly this here back in 2019, which you can probably find online somewhere. But for now, let me just suffice it to say that theism is a complex system of thought which was developed by some of the brightest minds who have ever walked this planet over the course of thousands of years. It may be wrong in the end, but it's not going to be dismissed by a simple objection like who designed the designer. Next question. Yes, I have a question. I think that it is fallacious to invoke an omnipotent deity just because we have some hole in our current scientific understanding. So, this objection is what's sometimes referred to as the God of the Gaps Fallacy. We have some gap in our scientific knowledge, we fill it with God. Unfortunately, I have news for you. The God of the Gaps Fallacy is not actually a fallacy. Anytime we know anything, whether it's in science or anywhere else, It's because we have a hole in our current knowledge which is filled by postulating some other theory or some other entity. We saw that back when we looked at the cosmic microwave background data. We have this hole of explaining why the cosmic microwave background looks the way it does, which is filled by postulating a universe with inflation and dark energy. A detective may have a hole in terms of all of these clues at the crime scene, which is filled by postulating that George is the killer. Anytime we know anything, it's because there's a hole which is filled by that thing. And God is no different. Now, the reason why the God of the Gaps quote-unquote fallacy actually resonates with us is because it's true that many times in the past, and even still today, some people will try to invoke God to fill some gap for which God is not actually the best answer. Back in the day, right, people would invoke deities to explain things like earthquakes and weather patterns and why certain people fall in love with others. And even today, there are plenty of scientific questions for which God is just not the best answer. I don't understand galaxy formation. I don't understand high temperature superconductivity. But I can tell you right now that the correct answer to these things is not simply God did it. There is definitely some sort of scientific explanation which we're lacking, which I don't know and nobody knows yet, but there is some sort of scientific explanation for those things. However, the hole that we've been talking about tonight, the gap, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, is a very different sort of hole in our understanding. Think back to the chess analogy, right? The chess pieces could learn every single thing there is to know about the laws of nature in their chessboard universe. They could learn all of the rules of chess and still ask why these laws as opposed to some other laws. We could learn every single thing there is to know about science in our universe and still ask why these laws of nature as opposed to some others. Fine-tuning is not a purely scientific question. Remember, when we talked about the best ways to explain it, even if we didn't subscribe to design, we found ourselves going to a multiverse instead, which, as we saw, is also bringing us outside of empirical science into metaphysics. No matter how you slice this problem, you're going to need to go outside of empirical science about our own universe and into the realm of metaphysics, when we ask questions like why these laws, why this universe in relation to all possible universes. We're going to need to resort to metaphysics somehow, and my claim is that God is the best metaphysical explanation. Okay, last question from myself. So, my question is, there's so many places in our universe that don't support life. The overwhelming majority of our enormous universe is inhospitable to life. Instead of asking, why would God design a universe so friendly to life, shouldn't we ask, why would God design a universe so unfriendly? So first of all, in response, let me quote our Canadian friend when I say that life permitting is not the same as crammed with living beings from end to end and from start to finish. Fine-tuning is really a problem that faces modern physics, and it's a problem about our universe in relation to all possible universes. It's not a statement about life-permitting patches in our own universe. To me, what I think this objection really shows is that who or whatever designed this universe, if indeed it was designed, cannot be limited in any way by efficiency. And to me, this is actually the strongest argument against the idea that we live in a simulation. Because if you were some kid in some hyper-advanced civilization simulating a universe on your computer, and you wanted to get intelligent life, you'd be out of your mind to worry about the dynamics of black hole mergers in distant galaxies. This would be an enormous waste of computational resources. With that same amount of computing power, you could simulate the dynamics of our Earth a zillion times over. All this argument shows is that whatever the designer is, it must not be limited by computational efficiency and computational resources. And again, this is starting to smell an awful lot like the God of theism. Now, I think that there really is, though, a noteworthy objection here, something that is surprising about our universe, which has surprised people for thousands of years, which is that this universe, which has amazingly, miraculously given us life, is someday going to kill us. Ironically, the same sun, which is responsible for warmth and heat and energy and food and life, is someday going to swell up and swallow up the earth and everything in it. And apparently that will be the end of the human story. And if this world really has been designed, this presents quite a puzzle. Because we could justifiably ask the designer, what is the purpose of all of this? If at the end of the day we're all just going to die, and that's the end of the human story. The best solution that I have is that just isn't right. Somehow, the designer, we can call it God if we want, is going to need to somehow intervene in this universe and change the trajectory of the human story. Presumably, to bring about the happily ever after that any great story really deserves. And this is where Christianity comes into the picture. Because Christianity says that this is exactly what's happened in Jesus. That the God of the universe has intervened by coming himself into our reality, changing the trajectory of the human story, and ultimately is going to someday bring about a happily ever after. And that's what we're going to talk about on Thursday. So I'll refer you with this cliffhanger to my talk then, and say thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that very interesting talk. Right, now we'll have some time for questions and answers from all of you. I would like to remind you about how the format will have an opportunity for you to ask questions by microphone, and you may also use Slido. So there are already a couple of questions on there. So you can either use, go to that link and enter the code when prompted. I'm going to give you a few seconds if you'd like to do that, to have a look. And I have done that myself, so I can see your questions on my phone. And we have a wireless microphone at the back. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, just raise your hand and Chris will bring over the microphone to you. So when you access Slido, we've got a question over there and a question over here. And before you ask your question, when you access Slido, you'll have an opportunity to type a question, and you'll also be able to see questions that have already been asked. And then you can upvote those questions that seem interesting to you that you'd like to hear an answer. So I'll let the question from the floor be asked first, and then we may look at Slido.
I think I'll agree with the person who asked the question before me. I think it was a great talk. And I'll also agree that you're pretty good looking.
Thank you.
So my question is, so I was sort of taking a couple of notes while you were speaking, so I hope to be able to put forth my question in a coherent manner. Mm-hmm. So I think the way I see it, and I'd love to know your thoughts on that, is that I think we fundamentally miss the point by trying to apply the scientific method to this entire discussion on intelligent life being a product of chance or whether is it a product of design. Because ultimately the scientific method itself is a tool that simply allows us to structure the observed universe. So from a scientific standpoint, I'll agree that science itself is a tool for discovering the laws of the universe. But from a philosophical standpoint, at the end of the day, it is also a tool for constructing the universe within our structures of thought. So, the structures of thought that allow us to comprehend the universe in the way that we do exists only within the configuration within which we exist, which I think sort of ties back to the idea of a multiverse. So what I'm getting at is that from within our structures of thought, everything will indeed seem fine-tuned. Because conscious and intelligent life is ultimately a construction that only exists within our structures of thought. So if the universe was fundamentally different, and if I again tie back to the multiverse, if there were indeed indefinitely many parallel universes, they would all give rise to fundamentally different structures of thought, and each of those structures of thought would imagine that the universe is impeccably balanced and impeccably fine-tuned. So I'll conclude. So what I'm trying to get at is that why try and explain fine-tuning from within our structures of thought using our rules of understanding? Because that will always lead to an idea that it's a miracle and that it's too it's too miraculous to be true, because it can only happen if it's structured this way. But the fact is that it can only happen in that way because we are thinking within the way that we think, and we can't think otherwise, is what I'm trying. I don't know if I was able to sort of convey it in a proper manner. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I definitely, I think I agree with almost everything, or maybe even everything that you're saying. That first of all, the methods of empirical science are only going to take us so far when it comes to this question. As I stressed again and again, this is ultimately going to be a problem of metaphysics. And you're definitely right that, if there is a multiverse, right, of the sort that I proposed, where there are all these different universes, some of them are fine-tuned, then invariably intelligent beings that are smart enough to realize all of this in one of those universes are going to find themselves thinking, wow, it's amazing that our universe has been fine-tuned just for us. And so this is something, this is why the multiverse, I think, is by far the best of the non-design solutions that I mentioned today. In that scenario would explain a lot. But I guess the issue is, right, at the end of the day, we still need to try to, if we're here tonight, right, if we're searching for truth, we're ultimately going to need to apply some sort of system of thought. And we're going to have to do the best we can with how our brains actually work. And we're going to need to try to figure out, what do we think is the best explanation? Ultimately, I think, for the reasons I mentioned, that the multiverse, although it's a very nice cartoon, there's a lot of work still to be done in making it into a theory. And the fact that so many people have attempted to build multiverses, and that so many of them seem to be either fine-tuned themselves or incomplete, is maybe suggesting that maybe our universe really is fine-tuned. The whole multiverse is fine-tuned. And I think it's at least worth noting, that as we've learned more about physics, you might have thought that eventually we get to a point where the fine-tuning started to go away. And instead, it seems that as we've progressed in our search for theories of fundamental physics, the fine-tuning has chased us all the way down. So maybe there really is something to all of this. I think I would actually also interpret, you talk about possible limitations of our systems of thought, as though that's I guess to me, that actually seems like more an argument in favor of design. Because what I often hear, right, is sort of this idea that science, we've learned so much about our universe that surely, with all that we've learned, eventually, ultimately math and science, the mathematical laws are ultimately going to explain everything. And that's one possibility that's sometimes suggested for why we should believe in a multiverse. But I think that it's true that we've learned a lot from science. The laws of mathematics have served us very well. But there's sort of a funny analogy that I once heard that, you could say we've learned so much about the integers, right? That, over the course of time, we've learned so much that surely, at the end of the day, the integers, an elephant is going to turn out to be an integer, right? Because we've learned so much, right? Eventually, if we just learn a little bit more, maybe if we just find a number that's big enough, it's eventually going to be an elephant. We all know that that's ridiculous, right? An elephant is not just an integer. So despite all that we've learned about the integers, we also know that there's going to be a lot that they're not going to tell us. And I think the same is true for these laws of nature. It's undeniable that we've learned a lot about our universe from the laws of nature. But that doesn't mean that that particular system of thought is ultimately going to explain everything. And I think what's also kind of interesting and worth noting here is just the fact that we actually have the capabilities to have these sorts of discussions at all. On theism, I think it makes sense because ultimately we, as beings who, at least according to Christianity and Judaism, are made in God's image, part of our job and part of our role in this world is to actually search for truth and to ask questions and to find answers about it. But if we do just live in a multiverse, if atheism is true, if there's no design behind any of this, it's sort of hard to understand why it is that we have these capabilities in the first place. This is not something that falls out just from saying that we have a multiverse. It's not something that's predicted just by that. And so the fact that we can even have these conversations, the fact that we can ponder our cosmic origins, the fact that our cognitive faculties are reliable despite being developed through evolution for survival rather than truth, to me is quite remarkable. So these are reasons why I tend to lean, just some of the reasons why I think I tend to lean towards design over a multiverse. But I think you're very right to point out some of the advantages of a multiverse, and that's why I do say that it is by far the best non-design explanation.
Question to your left, Chris.
I just want to say something in defense of empiricism. I come from a computer systems background, and in computer systems you generally try to figure out how it works, either by tinkering with it or reading the manual or both, and seeing, okay, if I push this button, this happens. And if I push this button, this happens. And I don't know how it works on the inside if I'm not a low-level computer person, but I know eventually I figure out how it works. So given this, at some point I started looking for, hey, maybe I can do this with reality, the system that I live in. And what better approach to take is to look at existing manuals of how people have done it in the past and how people suggest doing it, and at least give it a try. And if there's a suggestion for showing your gratitude and doing nice things without asking for anything in return, and then asking for what you want with good intentions, maybe I'll just give it a try and see what happens. And approaching it from a purely empirical perspective, again, not knowing, having no idea how it works on the inside. I'm not a physicist. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's one of the things missing from the debate, is we're focusing so much in theory of how it could work, and we're trying to figure out something that right now is way beyond us. Whereas just a little bit of trial and error it sure changed my mind. Just trying these simple things. Just asking for what I want, sitting down, like exactly like it says, closing the door and sitting down and having a conversation. And I had a funny experience the other day. I met up with a guy who's a pretty hardcore atheist. And I told him a couple of my experience about prayer and so on. And he said, well, you prayed and then it happened, but it was very likely that would happen anyway. The chances were in terms of that. And then I walked back from meeting him and I stopped by one of those bookshelves. and I found 3 different books on prayer, and one of them I didn't even know was about prayer. It was a Conrad Hilton book, but it turns out that that book is about prayer as well. And I'm not sure what my question is. I guess my question is, have you tried addressing this with a dare of sorts, as like, well, okay, you're such a hardcore atheist, I dare you to try praying. I dare you to sit down in the room and seriously put something out there and do one nice thing without asking for repayment and just seeing what happens. And if that's if you've ever tried that, if that's ever been effective for you.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, I think I definitely, well, let me say first of all that I definitely agree, that we're here today talking about a very intellectual, very high-level, scientific, philosophical argument for the existence of God. And certainly in reality, I don't know, I know maybe one person who came to belief in God solely, or at least predominantly, from this sort of argument. I think it's a darn good thing that one doesn't need to have a PhD in physics to worship God. I think it would be pretty hard for me to believe in the sort of God who only allows access to the most intellectually, the most educated of individuals. And the reality is that, at least the way that Jesus describes God is as a God who has a preference for the poor, the marginalized, the uneducated. And so in reality, most people come to God through those sorts of means. Now, I was asked to give a talk here on the reason for God tonight, right? So I'm giving sort of a scientific, the sort of scientific backdrop for all of this. But ultimately, I think that you're right, that really what is often, not just often, way more successful in actually getting people to faith is to experience it. And I know that's for myself what happened. So I'm not going to give a whole long story of how I came to faith, but I was raised in a very non-religious family where we had like presents at Christmas and chocolate bunnies at Easter. But I didn't come to faith until my sophomore year of college. And part of it was sitting down, reading the arguments for, reading the arguments against Christianity. But ultimately what it really was my own experience, and starting to realize that Christianity just made more sense of my experience than any other system of thought. So I think you're definitely right. I think I would definitely encourage anyone here to not just wrestle with the intellectual questions, but actually also wrestle with the experience of God, because that is how predominantly people come to actually know God, is through personal experience. But I do think that there's something to be said for the intellectual arguments as well. And it's certainly for me, it was important to have not only the experience, but also sort of the intellectual satisfaction that I could call myself a Christian, both because I found it to be personally satisfying, but also because I found it to be intellectually satisfying.
Question from Slido, and if anyone has a question in here, raise your hand and the microphone will start to make its way to you. So the top voted question currently on Slido asks, if not every explanation needs an explanation, why does the universe constant have to have an explanation? I think what you referred to as the cosmological constant.
Yeah, that's a good question. And indeed, that's what most atheists would say, right? So ultimately that we have this chain of explanations that needs to end somewhere. And the question is, how does it end? Let me develop the analogy that I started to give a little bit here further, because I think this is a very good analogy, which is I could ask, what is holding me up right now? And there's this chain of things that are holding me up. My shoes are holding me up, and then the floor is holding that up. And then the foundation of the building is holding up that. And then there's some layers of the earth, and each of those holds up the one above it. And we could ask, just like with this chain of explanations, how is this chain of layers of the earth going to end? And there's three things you can imagine, right? One is that there is there's just an infinite regress, that the layers of the earth go on forever, that the chain of explanations goes on forever. That's not true, right? The layers of the earth don't in fact go on forever. And it's pretty weird to say that this chain of explanations would just have an infinite regress as well. Something like, there's a law that explains this law, that explains that law, that explains that law, and on forever. Or like, there's a God, but that God was created by this other God, who was created by this other God, and that goes on forever. Those are pretty weird. Another possibility is just that there's sort of this last magical floating layer of the earth. That's also wrong, right? No one in here is a flat earther, I hope. There isn't just like the layers of the earth don't just end with the last one. The other possibility is that there's the core of the earth, right? And the core is actually pretty remarkable, because if you're not aware that the earth is round, if you're thinking about the earth as though it's just these flat layers, and someone tells you there's actually this last thing, it's not in and of itself a layer, but it holds up all of the other layers, you'd say that I don't understand that, right? It's only when you see the picture of the round earth that the idea of the core makes sense. Now, in theism, God is defined to be sort of the thing that's analogous to the core of the earth. The thing that explains everything else, but which is by definition unexplained. On the other hand, to me, I would say that to say that our universe just exists and it just is a brute fact with no further explanation, to me, this is hard to believe, because I'm left with questions like why these laws instead of other laws? How did the universe come into being in the first place? To me, it feels more like the last magical floating layer of the earth. Now, not everyone would say that. Some would say that that ultimately there should be that ultimately the laws themselves sort of are this last thing. That they're just these laws, nothing explains them, that's it. It's hard for me to believe that this is true. It's not totally crazy to me. It's not totally crazy. I don't think this is a knockdown argument. But what I will say is that I think to me what's actually more impressive is not so much that this sort of reasoning eliminates the idea that there's sort of some last law, that there are just these laws of nature and that's it. To me, this really rules out things like the flying spaghetti monster and some kid simulating our world on a computer. Because when you have things like that, these beings that are out there, it really raises the question of what created these things. If whatever it is, the fundamental reality behind all of this is made up of some parts, like a flying spaghetti monster, it makes sense to ask, where are these parts coming from? And this is the nice thing about God. This is sort of the idea, even, of God. God is a simple being. It's not composed of any parts. It doesn't have any limits to its knowledge, things that we could ask. Why does it have this limit as opposed to that limit? This is the idea with God, is that God is defined to be sort of this entity which doesn't have any free parameters. It doesn't have anything that we could ask a question like, why isn't it this way instead of that way? Now you might say, I don't think that's a coherent thing, but at least it has this advantage to me over the laws of nature themselves, because I'm left with the laws of nature asking why these parameters as opposed to others. Again, I don't think this is completely compelling. We're getting really, really far away from science and really into metaphysics and philosophy. To me, the question of what is the fundamental nature of reality is not such an easy one to answer. I think that the best, given the mathematical order of reality, the things that make the most sense are either some sort of mathematical equation, which is atheism, or something like a mathematician, which is theism. I don't think either of them is necessarily much better than the other, but I think fine-tuning points us towards something more like a mathematician, which would have an interest in other mathematicians, other intelligent life.
All right, I think we'll be wrapping up soon. So I think I'll say we'll have two more questions. One, hopefully spoken question. So if you have one, please raise your hand. And then one from Slido. All right, we have a hand over here.
Hi, great talk. Thank you for coming and talking. Disclaimer, I'm an atheist.
Okay.
And if nothing else, you've convinced me that I need to pick up a physics textbook, I think. I'm a biologist.
Okay, cool.
So to me, I think it's really easy to think that the universe has been designed because we're here in the present. But I think that for many humans, and specifically I mean like Neanderthals and Denisovans and these extinct humans, it was obviously not, I think, designed for them to exist because they're no longer here. And I sort of want to know what your thoughts are on reconciling a designed universe with the extinction of other intelligent beings such as Neanderthals, Denisovans, etc.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And also let me say, I'm glad that you're here, even though you're an atheist. So that's, I hope you enjoyed the talk. So yeah, I mean, I think what you're really getting at, and I think what you're describing, is ultimately a facet of the larger problem of evil and suffering in our world, where, you know, it seems like if I'm going to say that we've been designed, then it raises the question of what exactly have we been designed for? And when you look at some of instances like that, it's really not so clear, you know, what is the purpose of all these, you know, species which have gone extinct? And even more generally, what's the purpose of all of this death, all of this suffering, all of these problems in our world? This is certainly not the day when I'm going to, I've already been rambling in these answers as it is. I'm not about to ramble for 40 minutes and give a complete answer to the problem of evil and suffering. But let me say a couple things. I think to me what is maybe the most, one of, if not the most, compelling things about Christianity, especially compared to other religions, and I should probably include Judaism in this too. I'll say Judeo-Christianity, is that it's really a religion, or religions, which are founded on the answer, or I should say on the question of the problem of evil and suffering. This is how the opening chapter of the Bible starts out. We have Adam and Eve kicked out of the Garden of Eden, left to wander the earth, answering this question, or at least giving a partial answer to this question, of how did our world become so messed up in the first place? And this continues throughout the Bible. It's on every page, is this larger narrative of this question of why is the world so messed up? I'm going to have more to say about this on Thursday, but I think to me ultimately what is the most compelling answer isn't any sort of philosophy textbook response, which is probably what you want, and certainly what I would want too, is some sort of explanation. This is exactly why God has allowed this suffering, this death, these extinctions to occur. But instead, I think that what Christianity gives us, instead of a philosophy textbook answer to the problem of evil and suffering, is instead a person, namely Jesus. Christianity says that God himself has come and suffered with us. And while this doesn't, to quote a Christian named John Stott, this doesn't erase the question mark over human suffering, or in this case, Neanderthal suffering or animal suffering, but it does stamp boldly another mark over this question mark of human suffering, which is the cross, representing divine suffering. Stott says the cross of Christ is God's only self-justification in a world such as ours. I think to me that is it's a much more profound and compelling response to the problem of evil and suffering, that there's a God who cares enough about it to come and suffer with us, and who someday is ultimately going to do away with all of suffering. And I think this is the hope that I have as a Christian, that someday in the end, all of the suffering is going to make sense. I may not understand it now, but I do have faith that if God can turn one of the greatest evils and injustices in our world, namely the crucifixion of his own son, his own sinless son, into the salvation of the world, then I have confidence that he can somehow turn the rest of evil and suffering into something good as well. I don't understand how this is going to happen, But I think this is ultimately the claim of Christianity, that somehow the world is going to be set right, somehow all the sad things are going to come untrue, and somehow the world will be even greater for having once been broken and lost. Not a complete answer, but I'll have more to say on Thursday. It still won't be complete, but that's my answer for now.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. I think that's in the interest of time, I'll say that's what we have time for. We'll have Tom again on Thursday, and so there'll be more opportunities to ask some more questions. But I want to thank everyone who asked a question and those who put them on Slido. I saw some, maybe Tom, you'd like to look at it later on, some more interesting questions about the multiverse. But thank you all for your questions, and can we thank Tom again for his talk.